The grand chandeliers of the Heritage Mountain Lodge cast a brilliant shimmering glow across the vast ballroom, illuminating the swirling silks and polished leather boots of the wealthiest residents in the state of Montana. The music echoed beautifully through the heavy wooden rafters, filling the crisp evening air with lively melodies. Yet amidst the celebration, no one had invited Brooke to dance. She remained seated silently near the far wall, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching couple after couple take to the polished dance floor. One after another, the young women of the county were chosen by eager partners. Some smiled with radiant pride, while others made a deliberate point of twirling their impossibly expensive dresses just a little too close as they passed in front of her. With every new song that the band struck up, the isolation felt heavier. But the ache in Brooke's heart did not stem simply from being left alone in that quiet corner. The true pain came from the harsh, biting whispers of the wealthy women standing merely a few feet away. Some muttered behind their crystal glasses that perhaps no one had asked Brooke, because her simple, homemade dress was not elegant enough for such a prestigious gathering. Others sneered that the modest daughter of struggling farmhands would never capture the attention of anyone in a room filled with generational wealth and immense power. Brooke forced herself to ignore the cruel words, keeping her gentle eyes fixed firmly on the swirling dancers while trying, desperately, to maintain a brave, unbroken smile, even as her spirit felt crushed beneath the weight of their judgment. Meanwhile, in the very center of the grand room, nearly every affluent woman was aggressively competing for the attention of a single man. His name was Harrison, the undisputed owner of the largest and most prosperous cattle ranch in the entire region. Throughout the long evening, he had been approached and essentially dragged to the dance floor by practically every eligible woman present at the lodge. During every single dance, the exact same exhausting routine played out without fail. The women would relentlessly boast about their high social standing, attempt to impress him with tales of their family's investments, and shower him with compliments so completely exaggerated that they bordered on the ridiculous. A few even went so far as to shamelessly hint that they had been raised to be the absolute perfect wives for a man of his incredible stature. Harrison, however, looked increasingly drained by the endless superficial theater of it all. The fake laughter and calculated smiles offered nothing to his weary soul. It was in that moment of profound exhaustion that his wandering eyes drifted across the room and found a young woman sitting completely alone by the distant wall, a woman whom everyone else had deliberately ignored for the past 3 hours. Just minutes later, right as Brooke had finally decided it was time to quietly escape the suffocating humiliation of the evening, Harrison gracefully excused himself from a circle of admirers and began walking straight across the massive ballroom. He moved with a quiet, deliberate purpose that immediately drew the eyes of everyone in the room. A sudden, heavy silence swept over the lively party in an instant. The band continued to play, but the guests practically stopped breathing, freezing in their tracks to witness what was about to happen. When the wealthiest man in the county finally stopped before the humblest girl in the room and gently extended his hand toward her, absolutely no one could have possibly imagined that this simple, unexpected invitation would become the beautiful beginning of a story destined to alter 2 lives forever. Brooke had always quietly believed that the world was divided into 2 distinct groups of people. There were those who were born to shine brightly in the center of the room, and there were those who were entirely meant to be forgotten by the passing world. Ever since she was a little girl running barefoot through the dusty Montana plains, she had watched how certain women could walk into a crowded diner or a grand hall and immediately command every single ounce of attention. They seemed to carry an invisible, blinding light that no ordinary person could ever ignore or compete with. Brooke, on the other hand, had grown up learning how to survive gracefully in the quiet shadows of life. She had worked tirelessly alongside her exhausted parents since she was barely old enough to carry a pail of water, finding her deepest joy in the smallest, quietest moments that the harsh world occasionally offered. She owned absolutely no expensive velvet dresses, she possessed no diamond jewelry, and she most certainly did not belong to any of the powerful land-owning families that dictated the social rules of the valley. Yet, Brooke possessed something far more valuable, something that no amount of inherited wealth could ever buy or replicate. She carried a profound, genuine kindness and a fiercely compassionate heart. Throughout her small corner of the valley, Brooke was quietly known as the girl who would unconditionally help anyone in desperate need, even when her own family had barely enough food to place on their own wooden table. She spent her precious free hours nursing injured wild birds back to health with infinite tenderness, sitting for hours to listen to the lonely, forgotten elderly residents in the town square, and constantly finding breathtaking beauty in the barren, snow-covered landscapes where others saw only freezing desolation. Perhaps that pure, unbroken connection to the rhythm of life was exactly why she loved dancing so deeply. Whenever a beautiful melody filled the air, she felt as though the heavy burdens of unpaid bills and endless physical labor completely dissolved, granting her a few precious, magical moments of absolute freedom. Harrison's reality, however, was the complete opposite in nearly every conceivable way. As the sole owner of sprawling acres of prime grazing land, massive herds of premium cattle, and various lucrative investments scattered across a dozen northern towns, he commanded deep respect from every person he met. His staggering fortune naturally inspired profound admiration in a few, but it ignited a deeply suspicious, calculated interest in the vast majority of those who constantly circled him. Ever since the tragic passing of his beloved wife many years ago, his days had become an endless parade of wealthy women aggressively attempting to win his favor. It was painfully obvious to him that they were entirely infatuated with his massive estate and historical legacy, rather than the quiet, grieving man who actually lived inside the lonely ranch house. Because of this exhausting reality, he had confidently assumed that tonight's grand gala would be exactly like the 50 other meaningless parties he had been forced to attend over the past decade. He had fully prepared himself for a night of empty conversations and fake smiles. But destiny, as it often does, had quietly arranged a completely different path for both of them, setting into motion a series of events that neither of their weary hearts could have ever predicted. Harrison had absolutely no idea that the quiet, unassuming woman sitting nervously in the shadows would soon become the brightest light he had ever known. After Harrison extended his strong, calloused hand, Brooke remained entirely frozen in place for what felt like 10 full seconds, desperately trying to process the impossible reality unfolding directly in front of her. All around them, the previously boisterous ballroom had turned into a gallery of shocked, unblinking statues. The wealthy women who had spent hours violently competing for a single glance from him now stared in unhidden, bitter disbelief. They whispered furiously behind their fans, utterly baffled as to what this highly coveted, powerful rancher could have possibly seen in the only girl who had sat completely discarded the entire night. A deep, rushing heat flooded Brooke's cheeks, a fierce blush unlike anything she had ever felt before. For a brief, terrifying second, her instincts screamed at her to politely decline the invitation and run out the heavy oak doors into the freezing night. It was not because she hated dancing, but simply because she could not fathom the reason behind such a magnificent, unearned gesture. Gathering every ounce of her courage, she finally placed her small, trembling hand onto his broad palm, allowing him to gently guide her away from the lonely wall and step into the center of the polished floor. The band slowly transitioned into a beautiful, sweeping country ballad, an old, familiar melody that had echoed through the Montana valleys for over 50 years. Harrison offered a polite, practiced smile, fully expecting this brief encounter to be yet another awkward repetition of the dozens of dances he had already endured. He waited for her to begin boasting about her family, or subtly inquiring about the exact square footage of his grand home. But to his absolute astonishment, she did none of those things. This dance was completely, fundamentally different from anything he had ever experienced in his adult life. For the first several minutes, Brooke did not utter a single word about herself. She did not ask invasive questions about his vast wealth. She did not casually mention the rising price of cattle. And she absolutely refused to put on a fake, breathless persona to impress him. Instead, she merely closed her eyes for a brief moment and danced with a pure, uncontainable joy that radiated from the very center of her soul. When the tempo of the fiddle increased, her gentle eyes snapped open and sparkled with a breathtaking, innocent delight that left Harrison entirely mesmerized. As the musicians moved into the chorus, a soft, beautiful smile broke across Brooke's face. She clearly recognized the intricate rhythm of the guitars. "I absolutely love this song," Brooke whispered softly, her voice carrying a profound, nostalgic warmth as they spun gracefully under the golden lights. "Do you really?" Harrison asked, his voice betraying a genuine, sudden spike of curiosity that surprised even him. "Yes," she nodded gently, her eyes looking past him into a distant, happy memory. "My father used to play this exact tune on a battered silver radio in our kitchen when I was just a little girl. We would dance around the wooden table until we were dizzy." In that brief, incredibly simple exchange, Harrison realized something monumental. For the very first time that entire evening, the person in his arms was actually paying attention to the music itself and not to the size of his bank account. She was completely lost in the magic of the song, utterly unconcerned with the immense power of the man holding her. While every other woman had spent their dances stiffly trying to maintain a perfect posture and deliver calculated, witty remarks, Brooke had effortlessly stripped away the heavy pretense of the room. She was simply living deeply inside the melody, allowing the music to guide her steps with flawless, natural grace. When the final, lingering note of the guitar faded into the quiet room, Harrison stepped back and sincerely thanked her for the wonderful dance. Brooke offered a small, respectful curtsy, expressing her deep gratitude with a striking, absolute simplicity. There were no lingering touches meant to trap him, no hidden promises in her eyes, and no desperate attempts to secure a second dance. There was only a pure, honest thankfulness for a beautiful moment shared between two strangers. It was precisely that rare, unpolished sincerity that firmly anchored itself in Harrison's mind for the remainder of the long night. When he inevitably returned to his private table, the flock of wealthy Harrises immediately swarmed him once more, aggressively demanding his attention and violently competing for his praise. Yet something fundamental had completely shifted within his chest. For the first time in over 10 years, he had briefly held someone who genuinely wanted absolutely nothing from him. Meanwhile, as Brooke quietly slipped out the side door into the cold night air, she firmly believed that the magnificent dance would simply remain a beautiful, isolated memory to cherish in her difficult life. She had absolutely no idea that in just a few short days, the unpredictable winds of fate would forcefully cross their paths once again. The following week passed by with a quiet, grueling predictability for Brooke, as she immediately returned to the heavy burdens of her simple, demanding life. The magical dance under the golden chandeliers remained safely locked away in her heart, a secret treasure she replayed only when the sheer exhaustion of her days became too much to bear. She spent her waking hours hauling heavy bales of hay to assist her tired parents, meticulously mending broken fences on their rented lot, and desperately seeking any odd jobs around the small town to supplement her family's incredibly fragile income. She honestly believed she would never see the wealthy rancher again. However, miles away on Harrison's massive estate, an unexpected crisis had suddenly disrupted the perfect rhythm of the grand house. The head housekeeper, a wonderful woman who had managed the intricate details of the sprawling mansion for over 30 years, suffered a sudden illness and was forced to retire immediately to live with her sister on the coast. Harrison was left frantically searching for a trustworthy, capable replacement before the daily operations of his enormous household completely fell apart. During a completely casual conversation at the local feed store, Harrison's loyal foreman, Peter, happened to overhear a conversation about a young woman who possessed an extraordinary work ethic. The elderly store owner loudly praised a girl named Brooke, swearing that she was the most honest, meticulous, and dedicated worker in the entire county. He mentioned how desperately she was trying to find steady employment to buy medicine for her father and keep a roof over her family's head. When Peter relayed this specific information back to the ranch, that singular recommendation was more than enough for Harrison to make a swift, decisive choice. Just 2 days later, a sharply dressed messenger arrived at the dusty front porch of Brooke's humble cabin, carrying a formally sealed envelope containing a highly generous proposal. When she slowly read the formal offer of employment, she had to sit down on the wooden steps, needing several long minutes to fully comprehend the words. The idea of managing the grandest, most prestigious property in the entire state felt like an impossible dream for a girl of her lowly status. But the salary offered was overwhelmingly generous, enough to easily secure her family's safety and health for years to come. With trembling hands and a hopeful heart, she accepted the demanding position and immediately began preparing for an entirely new chapter in her life. On the freezing morning of her first day, Brooke arrived at the massive iron gates of the grand estate, just as the sun began to peek over the jagged mountain peaks. The property was vastly more intimidating up close than she had ever imagined from afar. The emerald pastures seemed to roll on forever, disappearing into the distant horizon. The wooden stables were as large as the entire town square she had grown up in, and the sprawling gardens were flawlessly maintained by a small army of dedicated landscapers. Over 60 employees buzzed around the property daily, keeping the massive agricultural machine running with absolute precision. It was on that overwhelming first morning that she officially met Peter, Harrison's deeply respected foreman. Peter was a tough, weathered man with deeply lined skin, known throughout the valley for strictly protecting the vulnerable workers from the harsh cruelty of the world. "So, you must be the famous Brooke," Peter stated, his stern face breaking into a surprisingly warm, welcoming smile. "Yes, sir, I am," Brooke replied softly, nervously clutching her small cloth bag. "The boss personally asked me to show you the ropes around the main house today," Peter said kindly, motioning toward the towering stone mansion. "I truly hope I won't be a burden to anyone here," she whispered, her voice laced with genuine apprehension. Peter let out a loud, booming laugh that immediately put her racing heart at ease. "Listen to me, kid. Anyone who shows up at dawn genuinely eager to work hard is never a burden on this ranch," he declared with absolute comforting certainty. Over the incredibly busy weeks that followed, Brooke effortlessly captured the hearts of practically every single person who lived and worked on the massive estate. Unlike the previous housekeepers who barked orders and ignored the lower staff, Brooke made a deliberate point to learn and remember every single worker's full name. She constantly offered a helping hand whenever someone was struggling with a heavy load, and she absolutely never complained about scrubbing the massive stone floors on her hands and knees. Furthermore, she treated the hundreds of animals on the property as if they were her own beloved family. She spent her precious 30 minutes of lunch break sitting in the sweet-smelling hay, gently brushing the manes of the enormous draft horses while whispering calming stories to them. Every morning, she secretly carried small handfuls of fresh berries to the noisy ducks living by the crystal-clear pond. She even spoke softly to the nervous chickens in the large coop, greeting them as if they were old, trusted friends. While a few of the older, hardened cowboys initially chuckled at her incredibly gentle nature, they quickly grew to deeply admire her pure, uncorrupted way of viewing the harsh world and respecting every living creature. She brought an undeniable light to a place that had been purely focused on profit and labor. As the crisp autumn weather slowly settled over the valley, Harrison began to notice a very curious, undeniable shift in the atmosphere of his property. Whenever he walked down the long, winding paths of his perfectly manicured gardens, he heard genuine laughter. Whenever he passed by the echoing stables or walked through the massive hallways of his own home, he consistently found his notoriously tough employees smiling brightly whenever Brooke was nearby. She seemed to unconsciously radiate a profound sense of peace and joy everywhere she went, completely transforming the previously rigid, silent ranch into a home filled with genuine warmth. Harrison found himself purposely altering his daily routes just to catch a brief glimpse of her, wiping down a grand window or humming softly in the vast kitchen. However, what absolutely no one realized was that there was one specific person who was violently enraged by this beautiful transformation. Her name was Amanda, and with every passing sunset, she watched the young housekeeper's rising influence with a bitterly dark, increasingly dangerous gaze. If there was one person on the entire face of the earth who was deeply infuriated by Brooke's sudden arrival at the ranch. It was undoubtedly Amanda. To the ignorant outside world, Amanda flawlessly played the role of the absolute perfect Southern aristocrat. She was always dressed in the finest imported fabrics, her hair was always perfectly styled, and she possessed an incredibly practiced, dazzling smile. Whenever she drove her expensive luxury car onto Harrison's estate, she made a wildly theatrical show of greeting the lowly workers, purposely ensuring that Harrison was watching her chariot. She would loudly inquire about the health of the elderly stable hands, excessively praise Peter's management skills, and even pass out small, cheap baked goods to the weary fence menders, all to paint a picture of extraordinary generosity. However, the exact second Harrison turned his back, or rode out to the distant pastures, the charming illusion instantly evaporated. Her sweet, melodic voice would drop into a harsh, cruel snap. The manufactured warmth in her eyes would turn into frozen ice, and her incredibly thin patience for the working class would vanish into thin air, leaving behind a demanding, ruthless tyrant. Amanda had been a constant, suffocating presence on the massive ranch for over 14 months. As the only daughter of a highly influential, incredibly wealthy banking family from the neighboring county, she had carefully mapped out her entire future. In her calculating mind, it was an absolute, indisputable fact that she would soon become the undisputed lady of this massive estate. It made perfect, logical sense to her. She possessed refined beauty, an elite social standing, and a deep understanding of the ruthless political games that powerful landowners played behind closed doors. Therefore, when she slowly realized that Harrison's piercing gaze was beginning to linger on a lowly, uneducated maid in a faded cotton dress, a deeply terrifying monster awakened inside her chest. At first, she felt a sharp, stinging annoyance. Then, as the weeks passed, that annoyance morphed into a violently toxic jealousy. Finally, it mutated into something far more dangerous than simple anger. Amanda began to shadow Brooke's every movement across the massive estate like a starving predator hunting its prey. She stood behind thick velvet curtains, obsessively watching how the rough, hardened cowboys eagerly tipped their hats to Brooke. She glared from the grand balcony as the massive guard dogs, who usually growled at strangers, happily rolled over whenever Brooke approached. She noticed how Peter, the stoic foreman who rarely smiled at anyone, would frequently laugh out loud during his morning chats with the young housekeeper. But most maddening of all, Amanda watched Harrison. She watched him with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. He was a master at hiding his emotions, never making grand, obvious declarations. Yet Amanda was a master at reading the microscopic details. She noticed how his heavy boots would suddenly slow down to a crawl whenever he passed the rose gardens where Brooke was weeding. She noticed how he would invent incredibly simple, unnecessary questions about household inventory just to extend a brief conversation with her in the grand hallway. He never did anything explicitly inappropriate, but the raw, undeniable softening of his eyes was more than enough to trigger Amanda's absolute panic. One exceptionally crisp morning, Amanda purposefully marched down to the large wooden poultry barn, having spotted Brooke through the kitchen window. Brooke was kneeling in the dirt, gently scattering golden kernels of corn from her apron, while speaking in a soft, musical whisper to the flock of birds eagerly pecking at her feet. The beautiful scene had just brought a rare, genuine smile to the face of Samuel, an elderly, crippled stable hand who was silently watching from the barn doors. However, Amanda found absolutely no joy in the simple beauty of the moment. "Do you honestly spend your time having conversations with mindless livestock?" Amanda sneered loudly, her voice dripping with extreme, concentrated venom, meant specifically to humiliate the girl in front of the elderly worker. Brooke slowly paused her movements, gently wiping her dusty hands on her apron before looking up into the cold, glaring eyes of the wealthy heiress. "Sometimes I do, ma'am," Brooke answered with remarkable, unbothered simplicity. "And do these stupid birds actually talk back to you?" Amanda pressed, taking a menacing step closer, her perfectly manicured hands resting aggressively on her hips. "Not with actual words, no," Brooke replied honestly, refusing to break eye contact. "Well, obviously," Amanda barked, letting out a sharp, incredibly fake laugh that echoed harshly against the wooden barn. "But then again, Perhaps that is precisely why a girl like you enjoys their company so much. Amanda leaned down, her face contorting into a vicious sneer. After all, none of them possess the intelligence to point out how completely pathetic you truly are. Brooke felt the sharp, deliberate sting of the insult perfectly, yet she actively chose to take a deep, calming breath instead of engaging in a screaming match. She simply lowered her head and continued tossing the corn, entirely ignoring the wealthy woman's desperate attempt to start a vicious fight. This quiet, unbroken dignity absolutely enraged Amanda more than any screaming insult ever could. Amanda was accustomed to people cowering before her wealth, or exploding in anger, which allowed her to play the innocent victim. But Brooke's incredible ability to remain entirely calm and deeply grounded drove Amanda to the edge of sheer madness. Destroying this peaceful maid became Amanda's singular, obsessive mission in life. Over the next 14 days, the subtle tortures increased exponentially. Whenever Amanda visited, she would purposely track muddy boots across the freshly scrubbed foyer. She would make incredibly loud, cruel remarks about the cheap quality of Brooke's shoes within earshot of the other maids. She constantly left expensive, glittering jewelry scattered across the dining tables, desperately hoping to catch Brooke stealing. Everything was executed with flawless, venomous precision, and always when Harrison was safely riding on the far side of the mountain. Yet, despite the relentless psychological warfare, Brooke never once complained, never cried in front of her tormentor, and absolutely never retaliated. Amanda was losing her mind. She desperately needed Brooke to scream, to break a priceless vase, to do anything that would prove she was a dangerous liability. Deep down in her black heart, Amanda had already realized a terrifying, undeniable truth. The real problem was not that Brooke was simply a beautiful girl. The absolute nightmare was that Harrison deeply admired the exact trait that Amanda could never, ever buy or fake: pure, unadulterated goodness. Late one sweltering afternoon, while furiously pacing the length of the grand wraparound porch, Amanda suddenly froze. Through the large window of the study, she saw Harrison standing completely still. His intense gaze was locked onto the dusty courtyard outside. Amanda quickly followed his line of sight and felt her blood turn into solid ice. Out in the blistering heat, Brooke was gently supporting the heavy weight of Martha, the elderly, fragile cook, helping the exhausted woman carry a massive basket of fresh vegetables from the delivery truck to the kitchen doors. Harrison did not utter a single word, but as he watched the young girl carefully wipe the sweat from the old woman's brow, a profoundly gentle, deeply affectionate smile spread across his hardened face. It was a brief, incredibly private smile that revealed the absolute depths of his hidden heart. Amanda saw it all. In that horrifying fraction of a second, the wealthy heiress finally understood that she was completely losing the invisible war. A cold, suffocating terror gripped her throat. It was not the simple fear of losing a minor social competition. It was the absolute dread of losing the massive fortune and incredible power she firmly believed belonged to her. That night, she sat completely awake in her luxurious mansion, plotting her final, devastating strike. It was no longer enough to merely insult the maid. She needed to orchestrate a catastrophic event that would permanently destroy Brooke's reputation and force Harrison to cast her out into the unforgiving streets forever. 3 days later, while wandering through the incredibly quiet hallways of the massive stone mansion, Amanda finally spotted the exact, golden opportunity she had been desperately waiting for. The sprawling estate was currently in a state of absolute chaos, aggressively preparing to host an incredibly important gathering of the most powerful politicians and cattle barons in the entire state. Every single employee was working endlessly to polish the silver, wash the heavy drapes, and ensure the property looked absolutely flawless. Due to her incredible attention to detail, Brooke had been personally assigned the terrifyingly important task of cleaning the Great Hall. This magnificent historic room was the absolute crown jewel of the entire estate. Its towering ceiling was supported by massive, hand-carved mahogany beams. The enormous floor-to-ceiling glass windows allowed the brilliant morning sun to flood the vast space, reflecting beautifully off the intricate crystal chandeliers that hung like frozen diamonds from above. The floor was a masterpiece of imported, dark hardwood that required hours of agonizing labor to properly shine. Brooke spent 4 grueling hours completely alone in the massive room. First, she meticulously dusted every single inch of the priceless antique furniture with a soft cloth. Next, she climbed a tall wooden ladder, carefully washing each massive window pane until the glass was virtually invisible. Finally, she dropped to her bruised knees, a heavy bucket of soapy water beside her, and began the agonizing process of hand-washing the massive expanse of dark wood. It was back-breaking, deeply exhausting labor, but she poured her entire heart into the work, ensuring that the room would perfectly reflect the immense pride Harrison took in his family's legacy. When the massive clock on the wall finally chimed noon, she slowly pushed herself up, her back aching terribly, and stepped back to admire her completed task. The great hall looked absolutely spectacular. The wood gleamed like dark glass, perfectly reflecting the golden light of the chandeliers above. It was at this exact moment of quiet triumph that the sharp, unmistakable clicking of expensive high heels echoed loudly through the grand archway. Brooke did not even need to turn her head to know exactly who was intruding. The arrogant, rhythmic tapping was the terrifying signature of Amanda's arrival. "Well, I see you are still miserably playing the role of the little housewife," Amanda sneered loudly, her voice echoing audibly across the massive empty room. Her eyes swept over the gleaming floors with obvious, burning disgust. "I am just finishing up my assigned duties, ma'am," Brooke replied quietly, nervously wringing her tired, damp hands. "Your duties?" Amanda repeated slowly, stretching the words out, as if they tasted incredibly foul in her mouth. She began to walk slowly across the freshly polished wood, her sharp heels deliberately striking the floor as hard as possible. She critically examined the spotless windows, ran a gloved finger over the gleaming piano, and finally turned her venomous glare back onto the exhausted maid. "It must be absolute torture," Amanda said, her voice dropping into a cruel, theatrical whisper. "Spending your entire pathetic life desperately scrubbing and polishing beautiful things that you will absolutely never, ever be good enough to own." The vicious insult hung heavily in the quiet air like a cloud of toxic smoke. Yet, Brooke simply bit the inside of her cheek, refused to cry, and slowly reached down to pick up her heavy bucket of dirty gray water. This absolute refusal to break down sent a sudden, blinding wave of pure rage through Amanda's body. Once again, the pathetic little maid was mocking her with that infuriating, silent serenity. Amanda's eyes suddenly darted to the large, heavy bucket resting near the edge of the polished floor. In a fraction of a second, her dark mind made a ruthless calculation. As she aggressively stormed past the exhausted girl, Amanda purposefully shifted her weight and violently kicked the side of the heavy metal bucket. It was a swift, incredibly calculated strike. The bucket immediately tipped over, crashing loudly against the hardwood. A massive tidal wave of thick, filthy, gray water aggressively exploded across the brilliantly polished floor. The heavy metal container aggressively rolled across the room, creating a deafening metallic crash that echoed terrifyingly off the stone walls. For 3 agonizing seconds, Brooke stood completely paralyzed, her eyes wide with shock as she watched her 4 hours of agonizing, back-breaking labor completely destroyed in an instant. The beautiful room was instantly transformed into a filthy, flooded disaster. "Oh my goodness! What an absolute disaster!" Amanda dramatically gasped, pressing her hands to her chest in a wildly exaggerated display of fake shock. She looked down at the massive puddle of spreading mud and slowly shook her head, a wicked, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "I suppose some people are simply born to be clumsy, pathetic failures," Amanda sneered, no longer hiding the sheer cruelty in her eyes. Brooke closed her eyes, took a deep, shuddering breath, and fiercely fought back the burning tears. She absolutely refused to give this monster the satisfaction of a fight. She slowly bent down to retrieve the empty bucket from the puddle, but Amanda was not finished. "Perhaps this unbelievable incompetence is exactly why no man wanted you at the grand dance. Perhaps this is exactly why you will die as a completely forgotten, invisible servant. You simply do not belong around civilized people." The horrific words slashed through Brooke's heart like jagged knives, expertly targeting her deepest, most painful insecurities. Still, she remained completely silent, falling to her knees to begin the agonizing cleanup. "Are you quite finished?" A deep, incredibly quiet voice suddenly resonated from the main archway. Both women snapped their heads up simultaneously. Harrison was standing perfectly still in the entrance of the great hall. His broad shoulders completely filled the doorway. His handsome face was entirely devoid of anger, entirely devoid of surprise, but his dark eyes burned with a terrifying, frozen intensity. He had been standing there for several minutes. He had witnessed the violent kick. He had heard every single venomous insult, and he had seen the absolute cruelty in Amanda's eyes. A sudden, paralyzing terror instantly, violently gripped Amanda's stomach. The heavy silence in the room was completely deafening. Realizing her carefully constructed mask was entirely destroyed, Amanda panicked. She dramatically threw the back of her hand against her forehead, let out a pathetic, breathy gasp, stumbled backward gracefully, and threw herself onto a velvet sofa, pretending to tragically faint from the sheer stress of the situation. The silence stretched on, heavier and more terrifying than before. Harrison did not flinch. He did not rush forward to catch her, had not yelled for a doctor. He simply stared at the pathetic, theatrical display with absolute chilling disgust. Without breaking his gaze from the fake swoon, he slightly turned his head toward the busy hallway. "Peter!" Harrison commanded, his voice echoing with absolute, terrifying authority. The tough foreman appeared in the archway almost instantly, taking one look at the flooded room and the woman on the couch. "Yes, boss," Peter answered, standing at rigid attention. Harrison slowly raised his hand and pointed a single, unwavering finger directly at the wealthy heiress, refusing to even look at her face. "Take the garbage out," Harrison ordered, his voice dropping to a terrifying, icy whisper. Peter understood the heavy command immediately, biting the inside of his cheek to forcefully suppress a massive, victorious grin. "Right away, boss," Peter replied eagerly. Without a single ounce of hesitation, the foreman marched directly over to the supposedly unconscious woman, effortlessly hauled her over his shoulder like a sack of cheap feed, and marched straight toward the heavy front doors, completely ignoring her sudden, panicked gasps for air. Amanda stubbornly maintained her ridiculous charade until the cold afternoon wind hit her face as they approached her massive, luxurious town car waiting in the gravel driveway. For her entire pampered life, this extremely expensive vehicle had been a powerful weapon, a massive symbol of her dominance over the pathetic working class. Now, incredibly, it was about to become the vessel of her ultimate, crushing humiliation. As Peter forcefully pulled open the heavy metal door, Amanda finally abandoned her fake unconsciousness. She snapped her eyes open, violently shoved her hands against the foreman's chest, and hissed with absolute venomous hatred, "Get your filthy, disgusting hands off me this instant!" Peter casually stepped back, completely unbothered, crossing his massive arms over his chest. "Well, I am certainly glad to see your miraculous recovery, ma'am," Peter drawled, his voice dripping with heavy, unapologetic sarcasm. Amanda's face turned violently red. "How dare Harrison treat me like a common criminal? I will ruin him!" she screamed. After Amanda was driven away and finally realized the magnitude of her mistake, Harrison returned to the great hall and found Brooke still kneeling in the flooded room, quietly finishing the cleanup despite the humiliation she had suffered. Deeply moved by her strength and grace, he recognized that she possessed a rare character unlike anyone he had ever known. In the weeks that followed, their relationship grew naturally through small moments together. Harrison found excuses to spend time with her, whether sharing coffee, riding across the ranch, repairing fences, or taking shelter from storms. Brooke listened to his grief without judgment or empty advice, offering only her sincere presence. Slowly, Harrison realized his feelings had become far more than admiration. He wanted to share his future with her. Even Peter noticed the growing bond and eventually encouraged Harrison to admit what everyone on the ranch already knew. A few weeks later, Harrison brought Brooke to his favorite ridge, overlooking the vast Montana landscape, and finally confessed his feelings. He revealed that he had fallen in love with her during the ballroom dance, where she alone had cared about the music rather than his wealth or status. Overcome with emotion, Brooke realized she was finally being valued for who she truly was, not for money or social standing. Holding her hands, Harrison told her he had admired her ever since that night. And together they began a new chapter, walking down the mountain hand in hand as the sun set behind them. Months later, when Harrison proposed hosting an extravagant wedding, Brooke preferred a simple ceremony. However, he explained that the celebration was not meant to display wealth, but to honor the woman who loved him, for who he truly was. He wanted her to always remember her worth and never again feel invisible or unimportant. Brooke eventually agreed, and their wedding became the most beautiful event the valley had ever seen. Surrounded by flowers, music, and joyful guests, the former maid and the rancher celebrated their love. As they danced together that evening, Brooke reflected on her painful past and realized that her hardships had not defined her. They had guided her toward her true destiny. Their story proved that kindness, integrity, and a pure heart will always shine brighter than wealth or status.